a quiet corner in a busy diner. The clang of cutlery and the murmur of 100 conversations washed over Elena the moment she pushed through the diner's glass door. The air hummed with the scent of sizzling bacon and stale coffee, a familiar symphony of midday chaos. She paused just inside, her gentle eyes scanning the sea of boobs and formica tables. Waiters, their aprons stained with the day's battles, weave expertly between patrons, balancing precarious stacks of plates. It was exactly as she remembered, a vibrant, unpretentious hub of humanity. A small, unoccupied two-top tucked away near a window, partially shielded by a wilting potted fern, caught her attention. It offered a sliver of refuge from the bustling thoroughfare of the main aisle. With a quiet grace, Elena navigated the crowded space, offering a small, polite nod to a man who nearly bumped into her with his overflowing tray. She settled onto the worn vinyl seat, placing her sensible handbag on the spare chair. From her vantage point, she watched a young couple sharing a milkshake, their heads close in a bubble of private laughter. An elderly gentleman across the room meticulously buttered a piece of toast, his movements slow and deliberate. Each face held a story, each interaction a fleeting tableau. A soft smile touched Elena's lips. She pulled her worn paper bag from her bag, but didn't open it. Her gaze drifted to the diner door, a pleasant anticipation bubbling within her. Mateo wouldn't be much longer. Mark's distracted service. The midday sun beat down on the diner's windows, turning the normally cheerful space into a humid, bustling arena. Mark, a sheen of sweat on his brow, weaved through the tables, a tray laden with steaming plates miraculously balanced. He caught a glimpse of Elena, seated patiently at her small booth by the window, her hands clasped calmly on the worn tabletop. He knew she'd been there for a while, but the group of boisterous college students who had just arrived at table 5, demanding immediate attention, seemed a more pressing concern. He swerved past Elena's table, his eyes fixed firmly on the far wall, a practiced maneuver of avoidance. He delivered a stack of pancakes to a table of tourists who had arrived a good 15 minutes after Elena, then circled back towards the kitchen, muttering under his breath, "Slow customers, always holding things up." His frustration was a tangible thing, a tight knot in his stomach. He snatched a freshly brewed coffee, its aroma momentarily cutting through the din, and delivered it to a businessman engrossed in his phone, again bypassing Elena's quiet corner. He could feel her gaze, not accusatory, but simply present. It was an unspoken pressure he found irritating. He slammed the coffee cup down a little harder than necessary, then sped off, the bell above the door jangling furiously as another wave of hungry patrons pushed inside. The rhythmic clatter of cutlery and the murmur of conversations seemed to amplify his own rising impatience. They ignored request. Elena's gaze, gentle yet persistent, drifted towards Mark. He was currently wiping down a spotless section of the counter, his movements exaggeratedly slow. She'd been seated for nearly 10 minutes, the aroma of brewing coffee and sizzling bacon doing little to quell her growing unease. A discreet cough, barely audible, failed to attract his attention. She then lifted her hand, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and smiled faintly when his eyes finally flickered her way. "Excuse me, young man," she began, her voice soft but clear, "might I trouble you for a menu?" Mark's shoulders slumped with an audible sigh, a performance clearly intended for her benefit. He straightened up, a dishcloth still clutched in his hand, and cast a dismissive glance her way. "Look, ma'am, I'll get to you when I have time. Can't you see I'm busy?" His tone was sharp, edged with an impatience that stung. A faint blush touched Elena's cheeks. The warmth that had been building inside her, a quiet anticipation for a simple breakfast, began to recede, replaced by a familiar chill. The bustling diner suddenly felt vast and isolating. A pang of sadness, a dull ache she'd grown accustomed to, settled in her chest. She lowered her hand slowly, her smile fading. She knew better than to push. Of course, she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. She would wait. She always did. Unnoticed discomfort. A familiar face arrives. Elena carefully stacked the sugar packets, her fingers tracing the worn edges of the dispenser. A sigh, barely audible, escaped her lips. The ache in her knees was a familiar companion, but the gnawing sense of disrespect sat heavier than any physical discomfort. Her decision was made, she would leave. Gathering her purse and the well-loved paperback she'd brought, she pushed her chair back with a soft scrape. Just then, the diner door swung inward with a whoosh of cool air. A tall, impeccably dressed man stepped inside, his gaze sweeping the room with an almost regal air. Mateo. His eyes, dark and sharp, quickly landed on Elena. A small, reassuring smile touched his lips. Mark, flustered from a dropped tray of cutlery, looked up. His eyes, already darting nervously, snagged on Mateo. The expensive suit, the confident bearing, Mark's mind instantly translated it into potential high-spending customer. He smoothed his apron with a practiced, if somewhat frantic, gesture. A wide, almost grotesque, smile plastered itself across his face as he practically jogged towards the newcomer. "Welcome, sir. Right this way, please. Any table you desire, we'll make it happen," he gushed, completely oblivious to the man's true purpose. The shocking revelation. The diner's bell chimed, announcing a new arrival. Mark, leaning against the counter, saw Mateo enter and prepared a dismissive, "Can I help you?" on his lips. But Mateo strode past him, his gaze fixed on a figure in the far booth. Mark's half-formed greeting died in his throat as Mateo bypassed him entirely, as if he were invisible. Mateo reached the booth where Elena sat, her untouched coffee steaming gently. A soft smile touched her lips as he approached. Without a word, Mateo leaned down, enveloping her in a tender embrace. Mark watched, a frown deepening on his face. This wasn't a customer meeting. This was familial. "Todo bien, mama?" Mateo's voice was a low rumble, laced with genuine concern, the Spanish words a foreign melody in the diner's hum. Elena patted his arm, her eyes flickering towards Mark for a fleeting instant before settling back on her son. Mark felt a cold dread trickle down his spine. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening thud. The elderly woman he'd so carelessly dismissed, the one he'd refused to serve, was Mateo's mother. The realization hit him like a physical blow, leaving him stunned and utterly bewildered. The owner's inquiry. Mateo squeezed Elena's hand, a reassuring gesture that brought a faint smile to her lips. He then turned his gaze towards Mark, and the warmth in his eyes hardened, replaced by a steady glint. The easygoing smile that had been on his face evaporated, leaving a stark, almost predatory stillness. Mark, engrossed in his phone, barely registered the new arrival until Mateo's shadow fell over him. "Excuse me," Mateo's voice was calm, almost too calm, cutting through the diner's low hum. Mark looked up, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "May I ask why my mother, who has been patiently waiting for some time, has yet to receive any service?" His eyes, dark and unwavering, fixed on Mark, stripping away any pretense of casual conversation. Mark's jaw slackened. The vibrant color drained from his face, leaving a sickly pallor. He glanced at Elena, then back at Mateo, a dawning horror in his eyes as he recognized the man. The owner. The realization hit him like a physical blow, his carefully constructed indifference crumbling into a heap of sudden dread. He opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. The air in the diner crackled with an unspoken tension, the clatter of cutlery suddenly seeming impossibly loud. Mark's desperate apology. Mark's face, usually set in an expression of weary indifference, was now a portrait of stark panic. He opened his mouth, but only a string of garbled sounds emerged, like a malfunctioning radio. "Mr. Rodriguez, sir, I didn't, he gestured wildly towards Elena, then back at Mateo, his eyes darting between the two. The cool, assessing gaze of Mateo Rodriguez, the district manager, was far more intimidating than any diner's health inspector. "I'm so incredibly sorry, ma'am," Mark finally choked out, turning to Elena, his voice cracking. "Truly. It was a terrible misunderstanding. I was stressed. Overwhelmed. I made a huge mistake." He wrung his hands, a nervous tic he hadn't displayed since his first week on the job. The air in the diner, usually thick with the scent of frying bacon, now felt heavy, suffocating him. He could practically hear the gears grinding in his head as he replayed every dismissive glance, every curt word he'd thrown at Elena. Mateo remained silent, his expression unreadable, a silent judge. The silence stretched, each tick of the diner clock amplifying Mark's dread. Elena, however, offered a small, gentle nod, a flicker of understanding in her soft eyes that only intensified Mark's shame. He knew then, with a sickening lurch in his stomach, that his career was hanging by a thread, and he had nobody to blame but himself. A lesson learned. Mateo's voice, though calm, cut through the diner's hum like a honed blade. "Mr. Jenkins," he began, his eyes unwavering. "We pride ourselves on respect here. For every customer, and for every employee. Dismissing someone because you perceive them as old or slow is not only unacceptable, it's a profound misunderstanding of what we do." He gestured subtly to a framed photo on the wall, a faded sepia image of his grandparents, their faces etched with a lifetime of hard work. "My grandmother, God rest her soul, taught me that true service isn't about speed alone, but about heart." Mark's face, already flushed, tightened further. He stammered, but, in the delay, efficiency, in Mateo simply shook his head. "Efficiency without empathy is merely a machine. You're in my establishment, Mr. Jenkins. Here, we treat everyone with dignity. If you cannot abide by that, then perhaps our services are not suited to your needs." Elena, who had been quietly observing from a nearby table, met Mark's gaze. Her expression was unreadable, a blend of quiet disappointment and weary understanding. It wasn't a glare, but a gentle, knowing look that spoke volumes of a lifetime spent navigating similar prejudices. Mark felt a sudden, sharp prick of shame, a sensation he rarely encountered. The bustling diner, once a mere backdrop to his frustration, now felt like a tribunal. The weight of Mateo's words, amplified by Elena's silent judgment, pressed down on him. He considered his looming deadline, the missed connections, and the very real possibility of losing a key account. The easy dismissal he'd offered earlier now echoed with a chilling finality.